Hello from the MIT Election Lab. Welcome to another video on our Learning from Elections project. Today, we're very pleased to welcome Katie Harbath, a fellow at the Bipartisan Policy Center. Previously, she was a public policy director at Facebook, where she was credited with building out and leading a global team responsible for managing elections. And Mara Suttman-Lea, who is an assistant professor of American politics at the Department of Government and International Relations at Connecticut College. They are also the host of the podcast, What Voting Means to Me. Thank you both very much for being here. And without further ado, I will turn everything over to the lab director, Charles Stewart.
Thanks, Claire. And it is a great honor, privilege, joy, bunch of other adjectives in there to talk to Katie and Mara about this really great project. We're really, we at Medsel are really delighted that we were able to support it and know there's a lot of really interesting research that's been reported already and will be even more to come. So why don't we start, and I'll direct this question to Katie, and just what motivated the work that you're doing? This is a slightly different. There's a lot of talk about trust these days in the election space, and you're going at it actually in a slightly different way. So can you just talk a bit about what motivated this project?
Yes, absolutely. So at the democracy team at the Bipartisan Policy Center, the work that I do really looks at that intersection of use of technology and online platforms vis-a-vis elections. And in talking to a lot of the election officials that we work with, there was a lot of concern and challenges around trying to figure out how we actually help people to not only get information, but where do they get information, and who do they trust to give them that information? In all honesty, part of the motivation was trying to figure out, if certain elected officials are the ones telling them about whether or not they should trust what's coming from these officials, who could potentially counter those messages in a way that those people might believe them, and thinking about that. And so that was sort of the motivation of wanting to ask the polling questions and really digging deeper into looking at some of the crosstabs and everything of looking at this, not only across political affiliation, but also across age demographics, looking at different states and how that might look, of trying to really understand. And then we also want to look at not just those you would expect, like the news media or these officials, but are there celebrities that people might trust? Are there business CEOs, folks like that, to try to understand who we might need to engage with, not only ahead of the 2022 midterms, but also as we go into 2024.
Great. Thanks for that. And so, Mara, do you want to talk a bit exactly what you did, how y'all implemented these ideas about who do you trust and who do you listen to in the actual research that was done?
Yeah, absolutely. So I was brought on to the team last summer. Myself and Mike Wagner were brought onto the team as academics who could support with the development of the survey. So essentially, we conducted a nationally representative survey, and then we also did oversampling in 3 states to ask a range of questions that got at the heart of what Katie was talking about in terms of understanding where the public is looking to for election-related information. And so we were coming at this, like Katie was highlighting, from a couple of different angles. We wanted to see where the public looks for information about how to register and vote, but also about election results, about election processes. But then we also wanted to gauge whether or not there are specific messengers, both election officials and public figures, that the public might be more willing to trust or to look to in order to have confidence in the electoral process. And we also did embed a pretty simple and straightforward experiment in the survey, just assessing whether or not the messenger mattered in terms of questions about trust in the election outcomes. And so we were looking at, whether or not a chief election official was telling the respondent, like, yes, you can have trust in the election, whether or not it was a party leader. And so I'm happy to talk more about the results and the findings and headline takeaways here in just a moment. But that was sort of the 30,000 foot view of our methodological approach. And it was really nice to both have the national sample and then to be able to have the data that oversampled and dove down deep into specific states, because that information is quite helpful when you're dealing with election processes at the local level.
So actually, just really quickly, what were the three states that were oversampled?
Sorry, I should have mentioned. Oh, at the thunderstorm in the background. Apologies. If folks can hear that, it was Colorado, Georgia, and Wisconsin. Apologies, I should have mentioned that. And yeah, it was an interesting conversation that we had as a team about deciding which states to oversample, and sort of wanting to get a range of different demographic and geographic locations. But I think each of these states offers such differences in election administration as well as political culture and climate. It was really nice to be able to dive down more deeply into those data and see what was going on there and see the extent to which it mirrored national level patterns and processes.
And Katie, what did you find?
So three of the main takeaways that we had from this was first and foremost that state and local chief election officials are highly trusted for delivering election information across political party affiliation, age, and other key demographics. Second, we found that 76% of voters, 89% of Democrats, and 67% of Republicans are confident that their votes will be counted accurately in the 2022 midterms, because we did this before last November. And then finally, that voters nationally are more likely to agree with a statement that election results can be trusted when it's made by their chief state election official rather than a Republican or Democratic Party leader. Republicans exhibit lower trust across messengers, even when the messenger was from their own party.
Good. And going back to what Mara was just talking about with the states, and it's a little bit of a curveball, either Katie or Mara. In terms of the three states that you all did a deep dive into, what sort of differences did you find across those states? Because you're right, I mean, they're very different political cultures and very different ways of administering elections.
I don't remember that off the top of my head. Mara, do you remember?
Yeah, I'm actually happy to talk about some analysis that I did on those states in particular for work that we presented this winter. And actually, what was quite surprising to me wasn't necessarily the differences, but sort of running models on the data from voters within those states was the similarities in terms of voters who are looking to their local election official for information about elections, for information about how to register and vote, they exhibit higher levels of confidence in ballot counting. And so we see sort of this trend in local institutions and the choice of local institutions, looking to those sources for information. We see this trend sort of persist even across these very, very different states. And so, that was sort of what I'm kind of getting into the next question here in terms of thinking about the implications and the takeaways. But it was really quite encouraging to see, this pattern that if you're looking to your local election official or your local news outlet for information about how to vote, that also seems to be translating into higher confidence in ballot counting, not at all levels of elections, but in the ones that we might.
Well, why don't we go there then? And I'm in all of these videos, we've been really interested in what I call the news you can use, and that's really the one of the big themes in this entire project is to not only find out more about how the elections of 2020, 2022 went in this time of really kind of unsettled elections, but to do research that we think people who are running elections can take the results and move with them. So, Mara, I'll start with you. What can election officials, legislators, and others take away from what you all have found?
I think the single headline takeaway is support your local election officials, give them the resources that they need to communicate and engage voters. So we're looking at, in this survey, the choice to look to a local election official for election-related information. And if you look at the relationship between that and voter confidence at different levels of ballot counting, there is a quite strong and robust positive relationship there. And so essentially, we have found that the power of local institutions to generate trust in the public remains quite strong. It's pretty well established that folks who are closer to home, who are more familiar with their constituents, with the serve, there's going to be a closer trusting relationship there. So I think that to election officials, I would suggest to do what you can, of course, with the resources that you have to cultivate this friends and neighbors type politics approach with their constituents. I think that could translate into the messages that they put out there on social media and the other voter education and outreach efforts. But there really does seem to be a robust relationship between the local relationships that folks have with their election officials and voters both looking to them for information about how to vote, which is what we want. They're the accurate, trusted sources of information, but then also that sort of translating into voters having more certainty and confidence in the process of election administration. And we do see this at the personal, local, and state level of ballot counting, which is really encouraging. Usually sort of the higher you get up or the further away from home you get when you're being asked to think about ballot counting and election confidence, that confidence diminishes. So yeah, to state legislators and folks who have chances to support local election officials, please support them and help them become more engaged with their communities. And of course, many of them already are quite engaged. And then to local election officials, of course, with limited resources, keep doing what you're doing and bolstering yourself as a presence and a networked presence in your communities. Katie, I don't know if you want to add anything.
I think the other thing too that I found really interesting was that people tended to trust their own election officials for how their ballots were counted, but didn't necessarily trust how those were being counted in other places around the country. And so I think that as we think about going forward and as we're thinking about this, it's important to educate people about why there are different ways that ballots are counted all across the United States. And that doesn't necessarily mean that there's something nefarious going on if that looks different than what their experiences are.
Right. So there's kind of the two sides of it. One is, Katie, as you said, kind of the broad general education, which is hard for a local election official to do. But that's something that state and national officials might be able to do. But for local officials, one of the things I'm taking away from your work is local officials have maybe not a big lift, but in explaining what they do, because their voters trust them. It's giving local officials the access to the voters. And so communications, which says to me things like money for communication strategies, websites, those sorts of things that sometimes or oftentimes are seen as being extravagances or self-indulgent, but they're really important tools for election officials to use.
And one thing that we found as well is, people are very much using search and Google search in which to find a lot of this information. So it's also thinking about how we make those connections between the local officials and these online platforms that people are going to actually find this information and ensuring not only its accuracy, but also kind of helping to, again, connect those dots or provide a little bit more of context to people around how this entire process works.
Right.
Yeah, and related. Sorry, go ahead, Charles.
No, go ahead.
I was going to say, related to that point, we've talked to local election officials. I've heard about local election officials who sometimes do have the resources to boost their profile on a Google search. So their office, if you search voting elections in Clark County, that's the first, the local office page, Facebook page, website, whatever it is the first thing that comes up. But that's not something that all local election officials are aware of or have the resources to do. And so, a lot of this, I think, comes down to offering both insight into sort of what's out there and how these folks can connect with their communities, but also the resources and support to be able to do so, like you said, website building, different communication strategies, advertising, things like that.
So in other words, get somebody to help you with web optimization and search optimization when you build your build your websites. Well, this has been really interesting and really informative. Thanks, Mara and Katie, for appearing with us. We'll have links down below to things related to this research, and as more things come published, we'll also link more and more. And so again, thank you. I'm glad Mara didn't get blown over by the thunderstorm that's moving through her hometown right now. And I will turn it back over to Claire.
Thanks, Charles. And thank both of you for joining us today. As Charles said, thanks to everyone who is watching this. If you would like to learn more about the research we discussed, there will be links in the description box below. If you'd like to hear about future videos, go ahead and subscribe. And until next time, keep talking elections.